A rancher lived alone for years, until a beautiful girl knelt at his door. For 12 long years, Thorne Whitmore's ranch hadn't known the sound of another human voice. The wind, the creaking of old wood, the low calls of cattle, that was all. He'd built his life around silence, wore it like armor. Out here in the middle of nowhere, the world had finally stopped asking questions, and he liked it that way. Until this morning. It was the kind of dawn where the light doesn't so much rise as bleed into the land, soft, gray, cautious. Thorne was making his usual rounds when he spotted it, a dark stain on the fence post near the east field. At first, he thought it was sap, or maybe one of the heifers had cut itself on the wire. But it was blood, thick, fresh, still glistening in the morning chill. Then he saw her, collapsed against the weathered wood, half buried in the tall grass. Her dress torn, hair matted with mud, breathing shallow. Alive but barely. Thorne froze. Every instinct in him said to turn around, walk away. He'd buried enough ghosts in this soil already. He didn't need another. But then she moved, just a flicker, a twitch of her fingers. Her head tilted slightly and her eyes, bruised, desperate, found him. She didn't scream, didn't even flinch, just whispered something so soft it got lost in the wind. Please. It wasn't the word that stopped him. It was the way she said it, like she wasn't asking to be saved, just to not be alone when it ended. And somehow, after all these years, that he understood. Thorne knelt slowly, careful not to spook her or himself. Up close, the woman looked even worse. Mud crusted on her arms, fresh bruises already blooming beneath the skin, one ankle swollen like a melon. Her chest barely rose. He hovered there for a moment, uncertain. This, helping her, this wasn't part of the life he'd chosen. He didn't rescue people anymore. Not since the war. Not since. He shook the thought away like a fly. You hurt? He asked, voice low, rough from disuse. Her eyes fluttered open, pale green, too wide, too alert for someone half dead. They locked on his face, and Thorne felt something shift in his gut. There was no panic in her eyes. Just exhaustion, pain, and something else, recognition, no desperation. They're coming, she whispered. Thorne looked around, empty horizon, no hoofbeats, no dust trails. Who? She swallowed. The men from Deadrock, I ran, they'll find me. And just like that, the silence shattered. Deadrock. He hadn't heard that name in years. Mining town turned ghost town, then rumor mill for every outlaw tale in the territory. If she'd run from there and lived, it meant something bad. Real bad. He leaned back, calculating. She could be lying, could be bait. A trap sent by someone who hadn't forgotten his name. Maybe she wasn't alone. Maybe they were watching right now, waiting for him to drag her inside. But then he looked at her again, the way she winced with each breath. The dried blood crusted on her jaw, the ripped dress hanging off her shoulder. She wasn't faking this. You got a name? He asked. Sarah, she whispered. It was a small name, soft. Didn't belong in a place like this. He rubbed his jaw. Well, Sarah, you picked one hell of a fence to die under. She tried to smile, failed, didn't plan it. Thorne sighed. It would have been easier to walk away, would have kept things simple. But he hadn't felt this tangled up inside in over a decade. The weight in his chest wasn't just fear, it was memory. Of others he hadn't helped. Of too many endings. He cursed under his breath, stood and reached for her. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get you inside, but if you're lying to me." Sarah didn't answer. She just closed her eyes again. The cabin was cold, even with the stove burning. Thorne had wrapped her in one of his old wool blankets, the kind that still smelled faintly of gun oil and pine. She hadn't spoken much since he laid her down on the cot, only mumbled once about water, which he fetched without a word. Now she sat up slightly, back propped against the wall, steam curling from the tin mug in her hands. Her face looked a little less gray under the firelight, but her eyes, those stayed haunted. "They'll come tonight," she said quietly. "Or tomorrow morning, depends how fast they track." Thorne was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. He hadn't touched his coffee. "You said Deadrock. What happened there?" Sarah stared into the fire. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke slow, like each word carried splinters. "There was a deal. Silver mine just outside town. A family, the Hendersons, owned the land. Some men wanted it, offered cash. They said no." She sipped the water, hands shaking. "So they made an example of them, broke in at night, shot the husband in front of the kids, killed the wife. One of the little girls ran. I was across the road. I saw everything." Thorne's stomach turned. Not at the story he'd heard worse in war, but at her voice. The steadiness of it. No dramatics, no begging, just cold, hard recounting. The kind that only comes from someone who's seen real things and hadn't had time to cry about them yet. "And the girl?" he asked. Sarah's fingers tightened on the cup. "They caught her by the creek. She was 8. Silence dropped like an axe between them. Thorne looked away. He didn't want to picture it, but he did. Couldn't help it. "They saw me through the window," she added. "I ran, been running since." Thorne shifted his weight. A dozen instincts warred inside him: suspicion, dread, protectiveness, the itch of old trauma resurfacing. His better judgment told him to kick her out. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted. It blew dry from the east, carrying with it more than dust. Thorne knew the signs: changes in weather, changes in fate. His gut said the quiet was about to end. He was right. The riders came slow over the ridge, 4 of them. One held his reins like a lawman. One looked half asleep in the saddle, but it was the man in front that made Thorne's hands curl into fists. Kane Murdoch, clean-shaven. Long coat too fine for trail work. Eyes like polished steel, dead cold. They didn't dismount, just sat there like they owned the place. "You Whitmore?" Murdoch asked. Thorne stepped onto the porch, one thumb tucked casually behind his belt. "Depends who's askin'." "Looking for someone, young woman, dark hair, about yay tall." Murdoch motioned with his hand. "Seen her come through." Thorne paused just long enough to raise suspicion. "Nope," he said. Murdoch glanced at the others. One of them nudged his horse forward, eyes scanning the barn, the broken fence post. "Odd. Thought we saw fresh tracks leading this way." "Plenty of folks passin' through," Thorne replied. "Doesn't mean they stop." Murdoch's gaze sharpened. "Well, we'd like to look around, just in case." Thorne didn't move. A man's home ain't a public stable. "I wasn't asking." For a beat no one spoke. Then a drop of blood, dark, dried but still visible, caught the late sunlight on the porch floorboard. One of Murdoch's men saw it first, pointed. "What's that?" Thorne's jaw flexed. "Had to put down a steer this morning. Barbed wire caught her bad." "Funny," Murdoch said, sliding off his horse. "That looks a whole lot like human blood to me." He stepped forward, so did the others. Inside the cabin, Sarah held her breath, tucked behind the wood stove with a pistol in her lap and fear in her throat. Outside, Thorne stood alone. A lie told. Kane Murdoch took another step forward, boots crunching over dry dirt. His coat shifted slightly, and Thorne saw it. The glint of a revolver tucked low on his hip, hand hovering a little too casual. The other men fanned out, one moving toward the barn, another circling toward the rear of the house. It was happening fast now, like the last few seconds before a thunderstorm breaks open the sky. "Funny place," Murdoch muttered, eyes scanning the porch. "Quiet, a little too quiet." Thorne didn't flinch. "That a problem?" Murdoch smiled, all teeth. "Only if you're hiding something." Inside, beneath a rug and old floorboards, Sarah could hear every word. The trapdoor creaked with her breath. Her hands trembled on the pistol, not from fear but fury. The names, the blood, the little girl's screams still echoing in her skull. She wasn't ready to die, but she was damn sure ready to fight. Murdoch's boot hit the first step of the porch. That was it. The wood above Sarah gave a soft groan as she shifted her weight. Thorne heard it, just a whisper, and felt the air shift behind him. Before Murdoch's foot reached the top step, the trapdoor flew open. Sarah emerged like a ghost from the grave, pistol aimed squarely at Murdoch's chest. He blinked, startled just long enough for Thorne to act. The old rifle cracked like thunder. Murdoch's shoulder jerked back in a spray of blood. He fell, cursing, hand yanking his gun free as he rolled to cover. Then everything erupted. Bullets tore through the air, splintered wood and whistled past ears. One of Murdoch's men went down screaming. Another ducked behind the well, firing wild. Sarah dropped low, crawling to the edge of the porch, blood soaking through her bandage again. She didn't care. Not anymore. Thorne moved like a man possessed, no hesitation, no fear. Just aim, fire, reload, duck, like he'd been waiting 12 years for something to matter enough to fight for again. "Stay low," he barked to Sarah, catching her eye between shots. She nodded, teeth clenched. "They're not taking me." "Not again." From behind the barn came the thud of hooves, one rider fleeing. Another tried to circle wide, but Thorne nailed him clean through the chest before he reached cover. For a few long seconds, Thorne moved with a precision he hadn't summoned in years. Every motion was automatic: crouch, breathe, fire. The muscle memory of a soldier buried deep but never forgotten. He'd trained to fight in the chaos of war, and today that man had come back. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. One of Murdoch's men tried circling the corral. Thorne dropped him with a shot to the thigh, then another to the chest when he reached for his gun. Cold, efficient, no time for hesitating. Hesitation got people killed. Beside the porch, Sarah reloaded clumsily, biting her lip hard enough to bleed. "You still breathing?" Thorne called, reloading behind a rain barrel. "Barely," she shouted back, ducking as a bullet snapped past her ear. "But I got one in the leg." He peeked over cover, spotted a shadow moving behind the smoke. Another shot, another body down. "You said they were from Deadrock," he growled. "Why?" Sarah's voice cracked. "They wanted the land." "What land?" "A mine silver. The Hendersons owned it, wouldn't sell." Thorne blinked. "The family you saw murdered." She nodded. "The girl, Sarah Henderson, she was 8, she saw too much. They killed her too." Everything inside him froze. 8. He didn't need more details. He didn't need photos or names, just that number, 8. A child, someone's daughter, gone for nothing more than greed. He saw red. It wasn't about Sarah anymore, or even the ranch. It was about every godforsaken thing men like Murdoch thought they could take without consequence. He pushed up from behind cover and fired 3 times in quick succession. No pause, no breath between shots. The last man standing on Murdoch's side crumpled without a sound. The silence that followed felt different this time. It didn't settle. It hung, heavy, angry, waiting for a verdict. Sarah limped over, breath ragged. "I saw her die," she said quietly. "She was hiding under the kitchen table." Thorne didn't answer, just stared into the empty yard where blood soaked the dirt. Then smoke curled through the dry air, mixing with the scent of blood and burnt timber. Thorne crouched behind the well, eyes scanning the tree line. Murdoch had vanished. Like a ghost, wounded, maybe, but not gone. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the ranch, warping shapes and sounds. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind sounded like a bootstep, a breath, a trigger. Thorne turned to Sarah, who was slumped against the porch railing, one hand pressing a makeshift bandage to her leg, the other gripping her pistol like it was part of her body. "You still with me?" he asked. She nodded, pale but fierce. "We need to finish this." Thorne knew what needed to be done. He hated it, but he knew. The shed out back, his old war chest. Inside, a crate of dynamite left over from clearing stumps years ago. The kind of thing you keep buried in dust, never expecting to need it again, until today. "I'm going," he said, already moving. Sarah's eyes widened. "You'll get shot." "Not if you keep them busy." Before she could argue, he bolted low and fast, a blur across the yard. A shot rang out behind him, missed by inches. Another. Splinters exploded near his boots. Sarah screamed and returned fire, her shots wild but enough to draw attention. Thorne reached the shed, slammed the door behind him and dropped to the floor, chest heaving. He yanked open the crate, pulled free a bundle of sticks, and wrapped the fuse tight with shaking fingers. No time for second guesses. Outside, chaos. Sarah fired again, dragging herself along the porch, covering him with every bullet she had left. Her vision blurred, blood soaking through the fabric at her thigh, but she didn't stop. Then silence. Too much silence. Thorne crept to the edge of the shed, lit the fuse with a match between his teeth, and stepped into the open. Murdoch appeared at the far end of the yard, staggering but upright, gun raised. He spotted Sarah first, smiled, raised his revolver. Thorne didn't aim. He threw. The dynamite sailed through the air like a falling star, trailing sparks, slicing through smoke. Murdoch turned too late. The explosion hit like thunder, cracking open the earth. Fire bloomed. The ground shook. Dust swallowed everything. When it cleared, Thorne stood panting in the wreckage, rifle at his side. Sarah stared, eyes wide, the pistol slipping from her fingers, and where Murdoch had stood nothing but a scorched crater and silence. Real silence this time. The dust hung in the air like a ghost unsure if it should leave. Bits of ash floated down, soft as snow. Somewhere wood crackled, small fires licking the edges of a broken world. But there were no more bullets, no shouts, no screams. Just silence. Sarah leaned against the porch post, eyes half closed, breath shallow. Her bandage was soaked through, but she was still there, still breathing. Thorne stepped forward slowly, like every joint in his body had aged a decade in an hour. He looked around at the carnage, the bodies, the blood, the crater where Murdoch had stood. Gone. One man, the last rider, had fled during the chaos. Thorne had seen the flash of his coat vanishing into the trees. Let him run. Let the story carry him somewhere far from here. For now, this place was quiet again. Thorne met Sarah's eyes across the yard. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The kind of silence that followed death was one Thorne knew well, thick, echoing, heavy with everything that could have been lost. But this one carried something else too. Relief. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Is it over? Thorne looked out toward the horizon, smoke rising like the last breath of war, and answered just as softly. Yeah, it's over. And for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't lying. The next morning brought a thin gray sky and the slow return of sound, bird song, creaking boards, the distant hum of life resuming after rupture. A trail of riders kicked up dust on the horizon. Sheriff Morrison arrived just past dawn, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing sharp, tired eyes. He dismounted slow, like a man used to finding bad endings. He didn't speak at first, just looked around. The spent shells, the blood-stained porch, the scorched earth where Kane Murdoch had stood. Then he nodded once as if something in him had expected this all along. You called it in, he asked. Sarah, still pale but upright, stepped forward. I'm the one who ran, from Deadrock. Morrison studied her, then turned to Thorne. And you're the one who decided not to let her die. Thorne said nothing, didn't need to. The sheriff reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a folded wanted poster. Murdoch's face glared from it in black ink. Been tracking him for months. Murder, land theft, 2 deputies dead outside Elkhorn. He handed the paper to Thorne, who barely glanced at it. He's gone, Thorne said flatly. I figured. Then Morrison turned to Sarah. You're the only witness left who ever stood up. If you're willing to testify, we can finally shut the whole damn operation down, mines, bribes, everything. Sarah hesitated. She'd spent so long running, hiding, choosing silence over survival. But something had shifted. Not just because she was still alive, but because she was done letting fear decide what she did next. I'll testify, she said, voice steady. Morrison nodded almost respectfully. Good. People like you, both of you, might just remind this place what right looks like. He started toward his horse, then stopped, hand on the saddle horn. One more thing, he said to Thorne. I've got a few deputies riding this way. Might be some folks in town want to know what happened here. Might be some looking for help again. A man like you. He paused. Well, let's just... The days that followed were quiet, not the hollow kind Thorne had once craved, but a quieter kind of noise. The kind that came with mending things. Fences, wounds, trust. Sarah stayed. She didn't announce it, didn't ask. Just kept waking up on the same cot, feeding the same dog that wandered in from the hills, brushing dust off shelves that hadn't been touched in years. One evening, she stood on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in copper and fire. Thorne stepped out beside her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She took one without a word. Their elbows touched. That was enough. After a moment he said, "You're still here." Sarah smiled. "You offering me a reason not to be." He looked out at the land, scarred but still standing. "I'm offering you a home," he said, plain, simple, like truth. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. 6 months later, the story of the shootout had traveled far beyond county lines. Some told it with extra gunmen. Others claimed Murdoch rode with 10 men, not 3. A few even swore Sarah had thrown the dynamite herself. But the truth lived quieter than all that, in the steady rhythm of 2 people who had stopped running, in the vegetables Sarah planted near the barn, in the new gate Thorne built with his own hands. They raised cattle, and chickens, and hope. And while no one ever spoke much about that day, not the smoke or the screams or the crater in the yard, everyone agreed on one thing. The man who had once lived alone didn't anymore. Because sometimes the best things in life don't come wrapped in peace. Sometimes they come